All right, today we're going to be talking about the criminal justice system in Texas. I know this is a little different of a format that we're kind of using here. Kind of wish we had a classroom where we could actually do this. In the future, maybe we can do something like some kind of interactive kind of a thing with like Zoom or one of the other programs. I'm actually recording this in Zoom, so we'll kind of see how this works out. Been having trouble with the sound so far, so hopefully you'll be able to actually hear what we're actually doing. But today we're going to be talking about the criminal justice system in Texas. And so first thing to understand is to understand how we got here is to really understand, or having to understand kind of the things that led us here. Texas itself is one of those states, one of the very few states that existed on what was called frontier justice. If something happened to you, you pretty much took care of it yourself, and you hired other people to take care of it. Well, as we kind of evolved into a future state, we kept a lot of those traditions around. So like you see the Texas Marshals and stuff like that that are still kind of glorified in the whole concept of it. They still work with it, and they're still part of the whole system that we have now. Well, part of the problem, or part of the concern that has actually caused, is there's a whole go-it-yourself kind of mentality to our entire justice system, and sometimes it's quite often the solutions are a little more draconic than they should be. And so what we find is a lot of leaders of our government will get into government because, or not because, but by using the being a prosecutor and showing that they're really tough on crime. And so the more they do that, the better off their careers become, and the tougher and tougher things start to become. So what we've ended up in this situation is we're noticing that we're stuck between whether we should reform the system, because there are a lot of problems with it. We've kind of addressed some of them as we've gone along, or whether we're still going to rely on punishment as the only way to solve it. There's old thinking that goes back to about the 1950s and probably way before that, that says that the only way to really stop crime is to punish it harshly, and then people will think, okay, well, I won't do that myself. And well, that's never actually really happened. And most of the studies that they've done since then, pretty much since the 1970s on, have kind of indicated that never was really the case, but it's still kind of disputable right now. So whether or not that does give you solutions or not, sometimes is based on someone's personal interpretation of the whole situation. So in our state, we have a number of law enforcement agencies, kind of like a top-down kind of a thing. Besides the federal, we'll have the Texas Department of Public Safety, the county sheriff's office, and local police departments. And because of that, they have all sorts of different jurisdictions, and sometimes they kind of cross over each other and quite a bit. So the two things to keep in mind, at least for having to know, is the difference between criminal law and civil law. Criminal law, which is a violation of the Texas Penal Code, was originally created by the Texas Supreme Court, and it kind of rivals or goes along with the U.S. Supreme Court, the U.S. Constitution. And one of the concerns that we have with this is we created what are called mandatory minimum sentences. And sometimes if you've done something wrong, it adds to it. So like if you did something before that wasn't actually a violent crime, the next time you're actually put up into the system, you may actually be charged for a even more violent crime depending on what happened that first time, such as if it's the second or third strike. And we have a lot of weird third strike rules and stuff like that, in case you're not familiar with those. But civil law is a little different, because we kind of go for different standards on what we're looking at. And this usually involves private relationships, and it usually addresses financial matters. The different types of civil law, make sure that you know what those are: family law, tort law, contract law, property law. These are all different kinds of disputes that you would have with other people. Sometimes it can be against the state. And if it's against the state, then a lot of the same stipulations occur, but whether or not you can actually sue sometimes takes a jurisdictional approach. Sorry, my throat's kind of going bad, so I'm trying to drink something to keep going as we're doing this. The difference between the two, one of the differences between the two systems is criminal law requires beyond a reasonable doubt, which means when you have this jury, everyone has to say that person actually did it. Whereas civil law, it requires what's called a preponderance of the evidence, which means if you have 12 jurors, the majority of them, which is kind of hard when you have an even number, have to agree that one side won versus the other. A hung jury sometimes can end up with another trial. Texas has a really dubious reputation as a tough on crime state. And because of that, we sometimes get really, really tough on things that other states aren't as tough on, like drug laws. There's been a lot of reform going on in different states on whether or not we should be enforcing some of the laws that we have on those, or whether the penalty should be as high. And Texas has kind of stayed away from that, stayed away from actually reforming, as it's still one of the tougher states when it comes to enforcing any of that. It also has the 7th highest imprisonment rate in the country. And like I said, we have a high enforcement of drug-related crimes. Slowly that's moving or changing, but probably not fast enough. The national belief is it should change, but you know how these things can be, it takes a while. So we are reforming, but as I stated, sometimes our reforms are a little bit behind pretty much everywhere else. One of the big systems or big importance of, wow, I can't even speak today, one second. One of the big, I guess, controversies or more important things going on with our government for our criminal justice system is our juvenile justice system. The rules are somewhat similar, but you don't always have the same kind of punishments. The belief is that younger people, and by younger we're talking 10 to 7, ages 10 to 17. If you're younger than 10, you can't actually be tried for a crime. So sometimes what they'll do is, like a 9-year-old that may have committed a capital crime, they'll actually try that person as an adult. And there's all sorts of different stipulations as to whether or not someone can be tried as an adult. If one is tried as an adult, they're put into the complete system that way, and basically they're no longer considered a juvenile in the system. So a couple of different duties that are important to the juvenile justice system, at least in Texas, and those I've actually listed on here on the PowerPoint, so go ahead and follow through on those. I'm not going to list them all because basically I'd be rereading the same thing you can read in front of yourself. Again, juveniles are considered ages 10 to 17. You can't be prosecuted for a crime below 10. So like I said, what they have done in the past is try young people as adults. But there has to be a huge agreement as to whether or not they're actually going to do that. And all of this is, for juveniles, is covered under the Texas Juvenile Justice Code. Which brings us now to one of the complications that we have in our justice system in Texas, and that's our correction system. Now, Texas is not unique on this. The justice system in pretty much most states has been overwhelming to the point of where it sometimes makes it almost impossible, or practically impossible, to actually make a budget, because the budgets are so overblown by the amount of people that they're imprisoning that it's just ridiculous. I mean, in this country alone, we tend to incarcerate far more people than any other country, aside from some, really, really bad types of countries. And even some of those were less incarceration than they have. In our system, at least for Texas, we have a state prison system, a private prison system, which quite often is a for-profit system, so you can kind of see some of the problems that might be inherent in there, such as if they can make money by, giving the prisoners less, like food and good clothing or decent clothing, they're going to do it. And I really couldn't go into how many times they've actually done that. And then we have local government jails, and those are supposed to fall under the same rules as pretty much all the other jails, but the oversight is kind of not there. And it's really hard to oversee all of these hundreds of government jails, local government jails. And so there have been moves to make it happen, but quite often whoever the political power is in that particular time in those particular locations will do everything physically possible to keep the state out of forcing the local governments to do what they're supposed to do, because they do make a lot of money. But some of the fines and stuff go directly to the local governments themselves, and sometimes it's really hard to turn off that spigot. So for our criminal justice system, or at least for our prison system, the idea is the 3 R's, which is recidivism, rehabilitation, and reform. So the idea is to try to keep people from doing the same thing. So there's all sorts of attempts to make it really draconian and hard on the prisoners. But then there's another approach to it, which is rehabilitation, to understand that these people may be part of our system again. So we'd rather have good people part of our system instead of people who basically will go out and do the same thing again. And reform is to change the system, or change the prison system, in order to make things work better. We've had some success. Quite often, success is not shared with others. And so you end up in very little pockets of areas that know what they're doing, others that claim to know what they're doing but don't know what they're doing, but are really happy with the results they're getting from their political approaches to it. So that becomes a bit of a problem. One of the big issues in Texas right now, and it's pretty much in the country and the world in general, and that's the death penalty. Texas is one of the stronger death penalty states. In 1972, the Supreme Court ruled that basically we're not going to be doing executions in this country anymore, because it's not the right thing to do, all sorts of moral issues to it. And also it was claimed to be actual abuse towards prisoners. Well, in 1976, about 4 years later, death penalties were allowed again because a Supreme Court case basically overturned it. And now Texas is back out doing executions. Texas actually accounts for 30% of all executions in this country, and they do a lot. And so it's hard to stop them because it's believed to be a deterrent, and politicians will use it as a deterrent and sometimes run on the idea that they're a tough on crime politician, and it just seems to perpetuate itself over and over again. It's also very difficult to overturn a death penalty case. Once it gets into the system, remember, the appeals process isn't actually looking at whether or not somebody did it or didn't do it. What they're usually looking at is whether or not the proper procedures were covered in the actual trial itself. Now, there have been a number of cases of people who have actually been somewhat exonerated, or at least in theory, meaning people have found out they didn't actually do it, but they can't get out of the system because the appeals process isn't looking at whether or not they did it or didn't do it. They're looking at whether or not the proper process was maintained, and usually it was, which makes it really, really difficult unless somebody pardons them at the very end, which is usually meaning your governor or your president has to actually exonerate somebody. Harris County, which basically the Houston area, it's a suburb or it's a county of Houston, basically has the highest level of executions in Texas. So, as for legal representation, Gideon versus Wainwright was a case where it was believed that if we gave legal representation to people who are on trial, it will actually benefit the system overall, including the people themselves. So there was a huge argument that they didn't want to give it to him. Arizona was trying to like keep the idea of, you know, if we give people legal representation, then they're going to beat the system. Well, what they found out was, at least according to Abe Fortas, the well, he's not the Supreme Court justice then, he's a justice at that time, who argued that it would actually be beneficial to the states financially, because it would keep them from having to do these constant cases, you know, and the appeals over and over again, if they actually gave them lawyers the first time around, so you wouldn't have to worry about having to keep going back to trial over and over again. Anyway, so that's the idea. It's often called a Gideon. So the problem we have with a Gideon, and I don't mean the person, but I mean the concept of it, of giving legal representation to people, is that Texas doesn't really want to give the money to do it. So quite often what we end up with is low-income residents have to end up defending themselves. And you know the old term where it's like, if you defend yourself, you have the worst lawyer you can possibly ever have. So we also spend a fraction of what other states spend on legal aid. And Texas does everything physically possible to avoid legal aid to its indigent population. So a couple of issues being affected by reform: decriminalization, sentencing reform, such as, you know, are we forcing sentences on people that generally don't fit the actual crimes, especially with mandatory sentencing and 3 strikes laws and stuff like that. Police militarization. This is a new problem that's kind of new, but what happened is a lot of military surplus has been given to police agencies, and police agencies have started becoming more and more militant in the way that they actually arm their police officers. And you do end up with a situation where a police agency may actually be more looking like a military unit and start acting like a military unit. So instead of trying to help citizens, they're basically attacking crime, I guess is the best way to put it. It's not always that case, but without oversight, you can end up in that situation. Another problem we have is a civil asset forfeiture, which is like if you get pulled in for a crime, like say you're driving and they find something in your car, you know, like marijuana or something to that effect, they will search your car. If they find something else, they may force you to forfeit your car and everything in your car. If you had money, your money. And quite often it's very, very difficult, even if you were considered innocent and no charges were actually made, it's very, very difficult to get your money back, because once the government has it, they don't want to give it back. Fines and fee practices. There's one of the big problems we have is people can't afford fines, and so then they end up getting thrown in prison. In Texas, you're not supposed to be allowed to actually be put in prison because you can't afford fines, but it's sometimes they use all sorts of little go-arounds to get through it, and people still end up in prison. Suicide is a huge problem, especially in our prison system. And quite often that's bad neglect on the part of the state, and the state needs to do a little more to deal with that. The other thing is exoneration. Exoneration became a real problem when people started to realize things were done wrong, that tests were done incorrectly, that sometimes prosecutors became overzealous, tried to force all sorts of bad situations, which led to justice system misconduct, which is like a prosecutor who forgets to tell the defense certain pieces of information. Well, now it's legally required that they actually do that. So that's all I've really got for today. I don't even know if this recorded, and hopefully in the future we'll do this a little bit better, but trying to do the best I can, and hopefully all of this works out for us.